Good morning, good afternoon, happy Halloween, happy Diwali to all of you out there. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Milan Vaishnav. I am director of the South Asia program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I am really pleased today to be joined by my two colleagues and good friends, Sumitra Badrinathan, an assistant professor at American University, and Devesh Kapoor of Johns Hopkins SAIS, who is beaming in from Johns Hopkins' lovely campus in Bologna, Italy. Um, Today is an auspicious day for many Indians, but it's also a very busy one. So we are going to try to take no more than 60 minutes of your time today to present the findings of a brand new survey we've done of Indian Americans. Some of you who are on this meeting may recall that 4 years ago, ahead of the 2020 US presidential elections, we released a similar report, which was one of the first nationally representative surveys of Indian Americans, their political attitudes, how they thought about foreign policy, and their social attitudes. And we thought that 4 years later, in the middle of a very contested and very close campaign, that it was really worth going back out, doing another survey, and seeing where Indian Americans are today. And we're going to focus our remarks just on the politics, but I hope that you will stay tuned to our work because we will be following this up after November 5th with analyses of US-India relations and foreign policy, as well as the social attitudes and preferences of Indian Americans. So the way we're going to do this today is we are going to do about a 30-minute presentation that Sumitra and I will divide, going through the motivation, some of the methodology, and then our principal findings. And then we'll save 30 to 25 to 30 minutes at the end for your questions. So for those of you who are watching on YouTube, you can enter your comments. Those will come to us, and we will try to take as many comments and questions as we can before wrapping it up at 1 p.m. Eastern. So without further ado, if we could have the slides, we will get started. So as I mentioned, this is brand new work. It's just come out on Monday of this week. Results from the 2024 Indian American Attitude Survey. Next slide. I want to start with a word of motivation, which, I think for many of you is probably pretty obvious, but we feel that a spotlight on Indian Americans is really important. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. We know from census data that the Indian American population is roughly 5.2 million in the United States as of 2023, out of which we have about 2.6 million eligible voters. This is a relatively small group if you think about the entirety of the US population, but Indian Americans are now the second largest immigrant group by country of origin. They have surpassed China and only trail Mexican Americans. But it's also a group that has grown by more than 50% between 2010 and 2020. And 70% of the population that has come from abroad has come since the year 2000, right? So this is a growing, it is a dynamic, flourishing population. Next slide. The second reason I think we think it's important in some of you may have seen some of this data. This is data from the Pew Research Center. Indian Americans do very well when you look at any metric of socioeconomic status or attainment. Even among Asian Americans, Indian Americans are outliers in terms of their median household income. This data you see on the screen is from 2019. But the outlier status is even more pronounced in 2023, where the American Community Survey estimates the median household income of Indian Americans is 153,000 US dollars. And you can see on the right-hand side of your screen that 7 out of 10 Indian American adults have at least a college degree, which puts them far above the average for all Asians, which is about 50%, right? So Indian Americans are increasingly influential in their communities. They are seen as a class of emerging political donors and influencers and vote mobilizers in the states in which they live. Next slide. Of course, there is a third somewhat obvious reason for the interest in this community, which is for the first time ever, we have a presidential candidate of a major party who has Indian heritage. I'm speaking, of course, about Kamala Harris. She broke barriers last election as being the first vice presidential nominee with an Indian background. But of course, this is the first time we've had somebody at the top of the ticket. And I think there are questions about the extent to which Indian Americans are backing Kamala Harris because of that shared co-ethnic relationship. And that's something that we want to explore in this survey as well. Next slide. Last but not least, there has been some data coming out over the past several years to suggest that there has been a deterioration of the Asian American vote going towards the Democratic Party. For as long as we have survey data, we have seen that Asian Americans have been very loyal constituents within the Democratic tent. But if you look at this chart that I put up on the screen, particularly after 2016, we have seen the Republican Party make inroads into the Asian American community. In our 2020 survey, we didn't see much evidence of this, but of course that was a cross section. And so it's worth investigating 4 years later to see whether or not the Republican Party has in fact made inroads within this slice of the Asian American community. Next slide. So in 2020, we launched a new initiative called the Indian American Attitude Survey. The idea was to harness new empirical data that can really characterize the political attitudes and preferences of the Indian American community. What we are presenting today is data from the second wave of the survey, which took place just a few weeks ago. And we will, in a couple of places, refer back to the 2020 data so that we can show you what has changed and what has not over the past 4 years. Next slide. For those of you who haven't had a chance to read our report, if you have your phone, you can go ahead and scan this QR code that will take you to a link on the Carnegie Endowment website. You can read the report in full. For those of you who are too busy to read the 10,000 word report, there is a very easy one-page summary which gives you our key top lines. And those are the same top lines that we're going to really focus our comments on today. Next slide. Let me just say a quick word about methodology. This is a survey of 841 Indian Americans across the country. The data we're going to show you today comes from the US citizen subsample, which is about 714 people. This was an online survey conducted by YouGov, which is a leading data analytics firm, in the days and weeks between September 18th and October 15th. So this is pretty recent data. The way that YouGov works is they have a proprietary panel of more than 500,000 active US participants. And this is a trend that we're seeing in survey research more generally. Rather than the old-fashioned way of randomly dialing phone numbers, more and more survey institutions are creating online panels of people who opt in to take their surveys. But YouGov in particular has pioneered a sophisticated methodology to take those respondents from what we call a non-probability sample and then weigh and match them to what a true sample of the Indian American population looks like based on what we know objectively about their gender, their age, their race, their education, but also things like party identification and their political preferences, right? There's a great article by Nate Cohn, who's the chief pollster of the New York Times, which talks about this new methodology. In fact, rates YouGov as one of the best performing pollsters in recent presidential cycles. So we have a lot of confidence in these findings. There is, however, of course, as there is with any survey, a margin of error, a plus or minus 3.7%. So as you're looking at the numbers we provide, know that, of course, there is going to be what we're providing is a mean, and there's some variance around that mean. But with this sample, we feel pretty good about being able to accurately characterize the political preferences of this community. Next slide. Okay, this is just a table to show you what our data looks like compared to the American Community Survey, which is the major survey run by the US Census Department. And this is data from the 2023 ACS compared to our survey from 2024. you can see here that we have a higher proportion of U.S. citizens. Part of that is by design. We care about U.S. citizens because those are the ones who are eligible to vote. But you can see on most other metrics, the gender breakdown, the median age, the percent of our sample that is age 15 and above and married, those who have college degrees, matches really well with the ACS. The one place that doesn't match so well is median annual household income. But I would not read too much into that data because this is a pretty blunt instrument. Measuring people's income is very hard to do. And all we're doing in the survey is asking them to self-report. It is not a very detailed question. So while the sample looks like it's poor on average, there's probably a lot of noise in that household income data. Next slide. This is just a map of the geographic distribution. Those dots you see, those circles, correspond to where the biggest parts of our sample reside. And, obviously they're residing in places that are well known to all of us as having large Indian American communities. They include California, Texas, Florida, New York, New Jersey, and Illinois. But you can see that we do have representation from almost all 50 states. Next slide. Okay, very quickly, we are going to go through kind of answers to 5 questions that we had in designing the survey. The first, obviously, is how can we in 2024 characterize Indian Americans' political and ideological affiliations? Number 2, how are they likely to vote in this presidential election? How does that vote vary according to their personal demographic characteristics? Number 3, how do Indian Americans evaluate prominent political leaders, especially fellow Indian American politicians? Next slide. And number 4, how is Kamala Harris in particular? How is her presence on the ballot impacting political attitudes and voter enthusiasm? Again, as somebody who has, at least on a maternal side, Indian heritage. And last but not least, what are the policy issues that are animating Indian Americans this particular election year? Next slide. Okay, so very quickly, Sumitra is going to go through the details, but I just want to give you a quick preview, particularly for those who have to drop out early. Number 1, Indian Americans, we find, remain committed to the Democratic Party, but there has been a softening of their partisan identification with the Democrats. Nevertheless, 6 in 10 Indian American registered voters intend to vote for Kamala Harris, but that is a decline of almost 10 percentage points from what we saw in 2020. Most notably to us, there is a new and very striking gender gap in voting preferences, with women favoring Harris considerably more than men, and we'll go through some of those demographic breakdowns in a second. Next slide. Number 4, when you ask Indian Americans to rate other politicians, they actually have very lukewarm views towards many prominent, particularly Indian American Republicans, a few of whom ran in the presidential primary on the Republican side. I want to highlight that although the economy, issues of inflation, jobs, and so on were the most important, abortion has really emerged this election cycle as a top-tier issue, especially for Democrats and for women. And that's something that we find to be new and not present in 2020. Last but not least, we believe there are some structural barriers that present a Republican disadvantage with Indian Americans that is rooted in policy and policy positions that are at the heart of today's Republican Party agenda. So while there has been a tightening, we still think that there could be maybe a ceiling on how much tightening we're likely to see. Next slide. Okay, let me turn it over to Sumitra. She is now going to go through some of the details about the answers to each 5 questions, and we'll end with just a couple of words about the key implications of what we found. Over to you, Sumitra.
Thanks so much, Milan, and hi, everyone. I'm going to try in the next 20 minutes or so to walk you through what we think are some of the most interesting and impactful findings from our survey. So the first question, as Milan said, that we're trying to answer is, what does this community's political and ideological affiliations and leanings look like? Next slide, please. So in the graph on your screen is one of the headline findings from our survey where we ask respondents about their partisan identity. The question is, generally speaking, do you identify yourself as a Democrat, Independent, or Republican? And we see from this graph that in line with everything that we know from past surveys about the Indian American community, Our 2024 data finds that Indian Americans do continue to strongly identify with the Democratic Party. From our numbers, 47% of them say that they consider themselves Democrats, 21% Republican, and about 26% independent. Now, we know that we did this survey in 2020, so we can compare these numbers to Party ID from 4 years back. And as Milan mentioned, 4 years ago, 56% of respondents identified as Democrats, and in 2024, that's down to 47. So that's about a 9 to 10 point decrease in the percentage of people identifying as Democrats. Next slide. The next thing we sort of do is ask people about ideology. So not do you identify as Republican or Democrat, but how do you rate yourself in terms of whether you think you're liberal, conservative, or somewhere in the middle, right? So you can see down below on this x-axis, people are asked if they're extremely liberal, liberal, slightly liberal, moderate, slightly conservative, conservative, or extremely conservative. And we see that if you add together all of the liberal categories, a plurality of the sample, about 55%, place themselves on the left side of the ideological spectrum. And in comparison, a much smaller share place themselves on the right side or identify as conservative. I think what's interesting about these numbers is that if you compare them to 2020, we're actually seeing a small increase in the percentage of people identifying as liberal. But we just talked about how there's also a small decrease in the percentage of people identifying as Democrats. So that might indicate to us that it's not that the population has become conservative. It's maybe that they have some dissatisfactions, particularly with this version of the Democratic Party. Next slide. Okay, so the second question we want to answer, which I think is what a lot of people are interested in hearing about, which is how is this population likely to vote this coming Tuesday? Next slide, please. According to our survey, and this is one of our headline findings, 60% of Indian American citizens plan to vote for Kamala Harris, 31% for Donald Trump, and another 9% combined say neither of these candidates or that they don't intend to vote. Just as a reminder, this data is entirely from our subsample of US citizens. So everyone surveyed for this particular graph and for these numbers is eligible to vote on Tuesday. Next. So one thing we can do, because we have data from 2020, is sort of look at this over time. So how do these results contrast with Indian American voting behavior in the 2020 election? We see that for Biden in 2020 and Harris now, there's been about an 8-point decrease in the people saying they'll vote for the Democratic nominee. That is offset by about a 10-point increase in people who say they'll vote for Trump. So it does seem like there is a minor shift towards the Republican Party. I will just underscore one caveat here, which is that though we do have data from 2020 and now, this is not a panel. So it's possible that there are people that we interviewed this year that were also interviewed in 2020, but it's also possible that we interviewed an entirely different set of respondents. So I would treat these results with that caveat in mind because we are looking at cross-sectional data over time rather than a panel. Next slide. Okay, so this table just compares our numbers, which is the rightmost column, to findings from other surveys in the US that survey other ethnic and racial communities. And you can see that in terms of support for Kamala Harris and for Donald Trump, Indian Americans are sort of situated somewhere between Black and Hispanic voters. And then that's just to give you an idea of how this community intends to vote compared to other groups in the US. Next slide. So I think one of the coolest parts of our surveys, because we did so much on trying to get a representative sample, as Milan walked you through some of the methods, one of the advantages of the IAAS is that we're actually able to break down the sample even further by different subgroups in the population because we made sure to gather a sample that is representative of the Indian American community. So on this slide, you're seeing our main results, which is percent intending to vote for Harris and Trump, broken down by several different variables, demographic and otherwise. I want to focus, though, in this slide on the education. So that's the highlighted row on this table. And you can see that for people with a college degree and for those without a college degree, the share of respondents that intends to vote for Harris is nearly the same. The share of respondents that intends to vote for Trump is exactly the same. And I'm pointing this out just to underscore that this is actually quite a difference from other surveys that we've seen about the US population as a whole, and specifically with white Americans, where you tend to see what observers, reporters, and pollsters have called education polarization, where those with a college degree are significantly more likely to vote for Democrats, whereas those without a college degree are not. We don't see that gap over here. Both with and without a college degree, people are equally likely to vote for Harris or Trump. Obviously, the other interesting finding over here is gender, and I'm going to talk about that on the next slide. So we do see in our data, as Milan already sort of shadowed, that there is a pronounced gender gap in voting preferences, which is actually in line with the US voting population at large. Men represented by the red bars and women represented by the blue bars. We can see that men are significantly more likely to vote for Trump, pretty large margins, and women are significantly more likely to vote for Harris. Now, because we have fine-grained data on other characteristics as well, we're able to break this graph down further by age, and that's on the next slide. So what we do here is we split our gender groups, male and female, further into two age subgroups. Those who are 18 to 39, so under 40, and then those who are over 40. And I want to draw your attention to the under 40 group and the first column that says Trump 2020 vote percent. And then men, which is the second set of rows. So in this particular cohort, men under 40, we see that 23% of them intended to vote for Trump in 2020. Now move one column over, and you see that that number, 23, increases to 48%. So that's more than double the share of people saying in 2024 that they're going to vote for Trump compared to 2020. That is a 25 percentage point increase in men under the age of 40 saying that they're going to vote for Trump. We rarely ever see shifts that large in magnitude over time in surveys, so this is something worth underscoring. I will also point out in this table that if you look at women aged 18 to 39 under 40, there has been also a slight uptick in the share saying that they'll vote for Trump. So in 2020, it was 19%, and in 2024, it's 29%. So it does seem like both for men and women, the cohort under 40 has significantly moved towards the Republican Party and Trump, though for men, this gap is a lot larger. By contrast, the share of people above 40, especially for women, don't change from 2020. So this is the one subgroup that sort of seems to hold constant over time. Next graph, please, next slide. The other thing we do, and I think this is the last finding on the demographics, is that we're able to cut the data, not just by gender, but also by gender and whether people were born in the US or whether they were naturalized citizens. And so here also you sort of see a clear pattern with men who are US born. So I'll try to direct your attention to that particular row, men who are US born. And with that cohort, with that subgroup, you see that the share of people voting for Trump is much higher than the share of people voting for Harris. You don't see that with any other subgroup in this particular way that we cut the data. So it seems like there's something going on with the cohort of younger men who are born in the US that has made them change their preferences and become significantly more pro-Trump in 2024 when we surveyed them 2 weeks back. Okay, next slide. Okay, the third set of questions I'll try to answer with some of our data is how do Indian Americans evaluate prominent political leaders? Next slide, please. And so we have a bunch of questions looking at this, but today I think we're just going to talk about one key one, which is this graph on the screen. Has a lot of numbers, but comes from a question that we call the feeling thermometer. It's a question where we ask people to rate both political parties and candidates on a scale from 0 to 100, where 0 means I don't really like this person very much, I feel very coldly towards them, and 100 means I feel very warmly towards them, and 50 means I'm somewhere in the middle, right? So the blue dots on the screen are Democrats and the red dots on the screen are Republicans. And I'll sort of let the numbers percolate for a second, but highlight one specific thing. When you look at Kamala Harris, which is the first row on this screen, and also before I get to that finding, This question comes from the American National Election Survey. We didn't come up with it. And it's used as a measure to see how polarized the population typically tends to be around certain people or certain parties. So the gap between Republicans and Democrats is a measure of polarization. So now when you look at Kamala Harris, the first row, you can see that Republicans on average gave her a 42 and Democrats gave her a 78. And that is the gap between Democrats and Republicans on how they rate Harris. Now, if you come all the way down to Donald Trump, which is second to last, you'll see that Democrats gave him a 24, Republicans gave him a 77. And you can see visually how large that gap is between them compared to the gap on Kamala Harris. So while we've talked about a shift towards the Republican Party and so on and so forth, it seems like even with Kamala Harris, she doesn't seem to be nearly as polarizing as Donald Trump is to this particular sample. Next slide, sorry. Okay. The fact that many Indian Americans have rallied behind Kamala Harris when she became the nominee sort of raises the question of what might have happened if the Republican Party actually nominated Nikki Haley, who is also a person of Indian heritage. So to answer this question, we asked people who they would have preferred between Haley and Donald Trump. And you can see that significantly more people, 44%, say they would have preferred Nikki Haley to 31% of people saying Donald Trump. And that was reflected in the previous feeling thermometer slide as well. Next. And finally on this, well, the survey kind of asked respondents who they would support if November's race was between two Indian American candidates, Kamala Harris and Nikki Haley. And so here you can see that a plurality of people said that they would prefer Harris to Haley. But I'm also going to point out that, obviously Nikki Haley is not running. So it's possible that these answers were a function of the fact that Kamala Harris is just so much more salient in people's minds because she's the actual nominee. Next. Okay, the fourth question we're going to try to put data to is how is Kamala Harris's presence on the ballot actually impacting people's attitudes? Does it mobilize them more? Are they more enthusiastic? If so, why? And if not, why not? Next slide, please. So the first question we asked to answer this is whether the selection of Harris as the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party makes people more or less likely to vote. And more than half of the sample said that it makes them more likely to vote. About 33% of them said that it didn't make a difference to them. And only 12% of respondents said that they were less likely to vote because of Harris. Now, of course, people be more likely to vote because they like her or because they don't dislike her, right? That enthusiasm could cut both ways. So in the next slide, we kind of try to figure out whether they're mobilized in a positive or a negative direction. Next. So in this figure, we asked people whether the selection of Harris as the presidential candidate makes them more or less enthusiastic. And you see that 48% of people do say that it makes them more enthusiastic about going out to vote and about the Democratic ticket. Next. Now, the key question is, if it makes you more enthusiastic, why is that the case? So we provided respondents with a bunch of different reasons that they could choose from for why they were more enthusiastic about Harris's nomination. And this particular question was only asked to people who indicated to begin with that Harris's nomination would make them more enthusiastic. And you can see that about a quarter of the people that we asked said that the fact that Harris will be a little bit more of a liberal or progressive voice made them more enthusiastic. Some said that it's because she's younger, and some said that she would be more of a moderate and centrist voice. I think it's interesting on this graph, though, that the fact that Harris is Indian American, only 7 people noted that that was the reason that would make them more enthusiastic. So many more reasons are ranked above that on this graph. Next. And then so the inverse of that is if people said that they weren't enthusiastic about Harris, we also tried to inquire why that was the case. And this question was then asked to people who said that they weren't enthusiastic. And you can see that here also there's a bunch of different reasons, including Harris is inexperienced, I already made up my mind to vote for somebody else, or Harris is too liberal. Next. And so finally, the last set of data that I'll talk about is what are the policy issues that this particular community is moved by ahead of this election. Next slide. So first off, to start, we asked people to rank the top issues for them in this 2024 election by asking them which is the most important election issue to you. And we provide sort of an exhaustive or nearly exhaustive list of issues that they could rank. And we see that by far the most highly ranked issue is inflation or prices. Abortion, which wasn't the case in 2020, is now something that a lot of people say is also important. We further cut this data by gender. That graph is not on the screen, but I'm sure we can get into it more in Q&A, where we find that women are significantly more likely to say that abortion is an issue to them this time. Again, I'll point out on this graph something that I find very interesting, which is that US-India relations ranks near the bottom. It's only 4% of people saying that that's an important issue. And so in many ways, if you zoom out and look at this graph, we know it's about Indian Americans, but it could almost be a graph about any community in the US. And so I know we're going to talk in maybe Q&A about how Indian Americans are potentially different from everybody else. I think this is one data point to show that they vote like Americans because they are. And for me, that was something that I took away from this graph. Next. So the last couple of slides that I'll end with is reasons why people say they don't support both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, policy reasons, right? And so starting off with the Democratic Party, more than a quarter of our respondents said that they didn't support the Democratic Party. This is, by the way, people who said that they didn't identify as Democrats. And then we asked them, why is it that you don't support the Democratic Party? A quarter of our respondents said that it's because the Democratic Party is weak on illegal immigration. A bunch of different reasons that are listed below. Again, the last reason is because it's not good for India, showing that that's not a salient factor in people's minds. And then the next slide is the inverse of this, which is reasons why people do not support the Republican Party. Can we have the next slide? And so I think what's interesting here is there isn't just one reason like the Democratic Party that's over and above all the other reasons. There's a bunch of different things that people give equal importance to when saying that they don't like the Republican Party, including it doesn't support my views on abortion, it's tolerant of minorities, it's too influenced by Christian evangelicalism, and then gun control and economic reasons. So Milan previewed at the start that policy was one of the reasons why Indian Americans weren't as pro-Republican as perhaps some of us would have expected them to. And I think this is a nice graph, especially juxtaposed with the previous one, where people seem to have a prominent issue with the Democratic Party, which is illegal immigration. But when it comes to the Republican Party, it's almost 5 issues that occupy that central space, and perhaps then motivating them to say that they identify more liberal or identify with Democrats. So I'll stop there and hand it back to Milan to wrap us all up.
Thanks, Sumitra. Can we just have the next slide, please? So this is just to kind of rehash, but just for those of you who might have missed the beginning, just quickly to go over the key takeaways again. The first is that we do find evidence that Indian Americans continue to be a majority support for the Democratic Party. But it does seem, when we look at their partisan attachment, how they self-identify in terms of which political party they associate themselves with, we are seeing a softening or a weakening of that attachment. There has been a corresponding increase in the number of people who identify as Republicans, and not much change of people who are true independents and don't lean in either direction. 6 in 10 Indian American registered voters intend to vote for Harris. That is something of a decline from 2020. If you go back to the 2020 election, you had Indian Americans breaking for then Joe Biden at about 70-20. And now we are looking at them breaking towards Harris along the lines of 60-30, right? So there has been a decrease in support for the Democratic nominee and a corresponding increase for Trump. There is a striking gender gap, and I think Sumitra covered that really well, in voting preferences, with women much more favorable towards Harris than men. And when you look at men under 40 in particular, that seems to account for most of the gender divide, at least in this community. Next slide. Again, when we asked our respondents who are Indian American how they view other Indian Americans, specifically prominent Indian American Republicans, they tend not to rate them very favorably. All the ones we asked about, Vivek Ramaswamy, Nikki Haley, Usha Vance, the wife of J.D. Vance, the Republican vice presidential nominee, none of them get above 50% approval rating. Abortion has emerged as a top tier issue. It's not something we saw 4 years ago. I think it post the Supreme Court decisions in the Dobbs case, and the fact that many states have ballot initiatives or referenda on abortion is something that seems to have galvanized many Indian Americans, especially Democrats and women, which I think is not that surprising. But by and large, the Republican disadvantage with Indian Americans does seem to be rooted in policy, right? So uh, many Indian Americans in our sample who don't support the Republican Party say that they don't support them because they view them as hostile to minorities, too influenced by Christian evangelicalism, and are fundamentally opposed to issues like immigration. Next slide. So let me just to say kind of what are some of the implications of this in terms of how we think about this community, how we think about U.S. voting behavior more generally. I think the first is we need to stop and rethink our assumptions about voting behavior of visible minorities and immigrant communities, right? I think there has been this idea of kind of demography is destiny, and that the Democratic Party, which has been the natural home to ethnic racial minorities and many, and not most immigrant communities, will have a perpetual electoral advantage as the size of these groups increases, right? And clearly, there are many signs that suggest that is not true. Our survey is one of them, but of course, we can point to a whole host of others. The second is that Harris's self-identification as both Black and Indian, I think, led many people to assume that we would see greater support from those two communities relative to the support they expressed for Biden in 2020. We don't find evidence of that. As in line with the overall US population, I think our priors going into the survey was that younger Indian American voters would be more progressive, more liberal, and therefore more pro Harris compared to their older counterparts. But in fact, we don't find that. We actually find that older Indian Americans tend to be more positive on Kamala Harris than younger ones. Um, Given the fact that India has a reputation for being a highly patriarchal society, again, we expected going into this that naturalized male citizens, people born in India or born outside of the United States who immigrated here, then became US citizens, they would be more Trump. More pro-Trump than U.S.-born males, and in fact, we don't see that, right? And so, Sumitra earlier this week called this, the kind of hypothesis about the uncles, right? That it's actually the Democrats don't have a problem with the uncles; they tend to have a problem with males under 40. Next slide. Uh, there's a real salience in our data on immigration, particularly illegal immigration. No matter how you look at it, if you look at gender, if you look at age, concerns about illegal immigration are pretty salient across the board, right? And I think we've had this idea that it is white American voters who are the most concerned about illegal immigration, but in fact, so are many immigrants. Whether it is Indian Americans in our survey, Hispanics in other surveys that have been done, people who may have come to this country legally, take a very strong view on people who they perceive to be coming by circumventing the rules. A lot of the commentary in the media when it comes to political polarization has been about racial divides, about religious divides. And I think we are now seeing, again, consistently over time, over the past year or so, of presidential election surveys, the emergence of a gender divide. And that is not something that I think many people thought would be as stark. And we certainly didn't have priors that it would be so stark within this diaspora community, right? Now, whether this divide is ephemeral, whether it is long lasting, remains to be seen. But I think there's a question about whether it will emerge as a more solidified cross-cutting cleavage over time. So last but not least, just to kind of tie it all together, I think we have to be very wary of very simple narratives about what drives voting behavior, right? And in a kind of call for humility, including amongst the kind of analyst or academic class like ourselves, I think we know a lot, much less than we think we do. And this is not just a commentary about American politics. I think many of you on the call will have followed the Indian elections when it was seemed to be a foregone conclusion that the BJP of Narendra Modi was going to come through with a third consecutive parliamentary majority. And of course, that did not happen. Next slide. Let me just say a word about what comes next for us, for those of you who are interested in this work and would like to follow along. We have three things that we're planning in the coming months. The first is to do a similar deep dive into how Indian Americans assess the state of US-India relations under the Biden presidency and India's own post the May 2024 general elections. The second thing we want to have a look at is how Indian Americans perceive their own identity. How many of them embrace a hyphenated identity? How many of them see themselves only as Indian, only American? How do they think about issues of caste? How do they think about issues of religion, discrimination, and so on and so forth? And last but not least, we embedded within this survey some simple experiments to try and disentangle the relative weight or importance of things like ethnicity, religion, partisanship, to see, for instance, do Indian Americans, are they open to voting for an Indian American Republican because that person is an Indian American, even if they don't necessarily share the same policy views, right? We showed you some evidence to suggest that Indian Americans are a bit more skeptical about Nikki Haley, for instance. But we want to really dig into that to see how much does ethnicity in particular matter. Next slide. Again, we'll just end here with the QR code again for those of you who have not seen the report. We'd encourage you to read it. There's a lot more in there that we couldn't cover in the limited time that we had. And we would love to hear your feedback and comments. This is an ongoing initiative. We plan to continue to build a time series over time when we can track Indian Americans. So your feedback, your comments on what might be interesting to look at will be really valuable. So I think we can end the slides there. And we have a whole bunch of questions that have come through as we've been speaking. So let me invite Devesh Kapoor, our co-author and collaborator, who has written not one, not two, but three books on international migration, including two specifically on Indian Americans and the Indian diaspora. Devesh, let me bring you in and ask you a big picture question that came up, which is, how did the results of the survey differ from your expectations? You've been studying this group for decades now. What surprised you?
I think the behavior of young American voters, especially those born in the US, has been the biggest surprise. Prior to this, we thought that US born Indian Americans, partly because their parents, the household wealth is substantially greater than the American average. So they tend to go to particular types of schools in richer zip codes. They tend to go to, they're quite well educated. All of those factors would have led us to believe that they would be more progressive and liberal in many ways. And perhaps they are, because we've only seen, we have only shown you their voting preferences. But on that, it's clearly not the case. And that, why that's not the case, I have to say, we have to work more to disentangle. We've just shown the what, but not the why.
Sumitra, I want to just pick up on the finding about the young men, right? And to what extent is the shift we're seeing in our data, is that borne out by other surveys of other communities? And do we know anything, either from other research or from our own data, about why this shift might be taking place?
Okay. So one of our findings is quite similar to stuff in other polling data sets, but another one is not. So the shift of younger men towards Trump is something that every survey that exists so far has found, and that every pollster and every podcast is talking about. The Daily did a really nice 30-minute episode called The Gender Election that I recommend to people because it interviews voters and asks them about why they're shifting, especially young men, towards Trump. We're seeing a little bit of a shift towards Trump for young women too, though, which is not mimicked by existing data out there. In fact, they're showing the opposite, that young women are significantly more likely to vote Democrat this time, especially first-time voters. In terms of the reason, there's at least three questions that I see about what we make of the gender gap. We can only speculate. As David said, we look at the what rather than the why. And the sort of why are they changing or voting this way is better answered through interview, field work, maybe even experiments, some of which we hope to do in the future. But we didn't have questions to that extent in this survey. That said, we can speculate, and we know from what's been said in the media so far that there's going to be a bunch of reasons for why this shift. And I think one way to think of it is to think of what's changed between 2020 and now, right? There has been a desire for change in policy generally amongst young people. Young people have gotten more mobilized. COVID has happened, which changed a lot of the ways in which people interact with politics. Information silos and sort of polarization along information lines has become more pronounced over the last 4 years. The nature of the Republican Party has changed, and maybe its appeals, particularly to young men along a more populist line, have changed. And I think more importantly, the gender of the frontrunner of the Democratic Party has changed. So it's hard to say that it's one of these reasons or a combination of them, and so we can only speculate on that.
I would say, just to add to that, I think, there the kind of hypotheses that have been offered, include questions about, obviously the gender identity of Harris and whether that might play a role. Uh, Certainly across the world, we are seeing a yearning for change and signs of anti-incumbency, right? We've seen that in the United Kingdom, we've seen that in France, we've seen that even in India. And so it's not surprising that trend shows up. And I think the third is also, political socialization and information silos, right? We know that young American males, the influencers, their podcasts, their media diet, are filled with narratives that play well to the Republican Party's strengths, right? There's a lot of talk about the lack of social upward mobility. There's talk about illegal immigrants taking over the United States. There's talk about how the Democratic Party has lost its way. It's become too woke. It's been too focused on quote unquote DEI culture. So I think these are some of the hypotheses that are out there. And they probably are at work in tandem in some respects. There's another question about whether Harris's gender is playing a role. And, we said, Sumitra, that it might be playing a role in terms of being a barrier for men. But I was struck by the finding that you described, where when we asked people why they were excited about Harris, only 7% said it's because she's a woman. I mean, does that surprise you?
I think initially when I saw the data, both that and the small percentages of people saying she's an Indian American, both of those things surprised me, because I think our prior, which is now wrong, was that people would vote on the basis of ethnicity and gender and identity. I think, though, looking back on the data, they're still voting on the basis of identity, except it's a different identity. It's party ID, it's partisanship. That identity, I think, has become more salient in this election. And we know from just old theories of voting behavior and political science that people use partisanship as a cue to make decisions in their life, sort of view it as a lens through which they view the world. And I think zooming out, it seems like Indian Americans are no different on that front. That's what we're seeing from this data.
Devesh, let me just pick up on one of the findings that comes out. This difference between US born and naturalized Indians. I mean, uh, do you have a sense of why support for Harris might be higher amongst naturalized citizens than it is among US born, particularly on the male side?
I think naturalized citizens, for them, their Indian American identity is likely to be stronger because, their identities were formed when they were young, and often they've come when they're slightly older. So, to that extent, Harris's ethnicity, uh, in a sense, has greater resonance. They have greater empathy with that. Whereas for the US born, their identity is more American, right? I mean, for obvious reasons. Uh, and therefore, their socialization is also through the schooling, all of that is the socialization of other males, which is why we see their behavior really pretty similar to other ethnic minorities and racial minorities, whether it's Hispanic males or African American males. So I think that may be a plausible reason why this is the case. I think it's also why perhaps we see a larger fraction of Indian American voters who say they are independents, right? Because their partisan identity may not be as intensely partisan, because if you've been naturalized recently, you still are forming your political views. You lean some way. But if you're born here, then your views are much more deeply set, so to speak. It's hard in surveys to get a sense of how intense the partisanship is. And one possible way is to look at the fraction of voters who say they are independents, which is relatively higher in the Indian case.
There's a question in here about is the fact that 70% of those who are 50 and above in age support Harris, is that because they're more likely to be naturalized? And I think the answer is yes,
Yeah,
that there's going to be some interaction.
absolutely.
Um,
The very few US born are above the age of 50, if you look at the US census data.
So there's a question on here about religious breakdowns, and it's something that we didn't put in the report, but we obviously do have that disaggregation. There are some differences. So about 68% of Muslim Indian American respondents favor Harris, which is the highest across all groups. The next highest is those who have no religious affiliation. They may be agnostic, they may be atheists, or just choose not to have any religious characterization. That's around 64% support for Harris. And Hindus, which of course is the largest subset of this population, support for Harris is at 58%, right? So that's about a 10 percentage point gap between Muslim Indian American support and Hindu Indian American support. The lowest level of support, and this is something that we found in 2020 as well, is among Christian Indian Americans. There's only a 10 percentage point gap between their support for Harris and their support for Trump. So about 51 to 52% of Christians in our sample are plan to vote for Harris. About 41 to 42% of Christians plan to vote for Donald Trump. Sumitra, there's something that's come up time and time again in the questions, which is on Gaza, right? Which is what can we say? And I'll just kick it off here because this is something that is going to be the subject of our next paper, which is going to go into foreign policy in Gaza. I think what we can tell from the data we've analyzed thus far is that questions of foreign policy do not seem to have been topmost in people's minds. they tend to focus on bread and butter issues. Having said that, there is a perception, and we see this in our data as well, that this administration has been it can be characterized as favoring the Israeli people too much. Right, 43% of respondents say that is the case. Right, so it suggests that this could be a factor. But I don't know, Sumitra, if you want to add anything to what I just said.
No, not much. I haven't actually dived into that data myself, so I don't quite know because we've been saving it for the next report. But I will say that these sorts of the first point you made, which is that people seem to vote on bread butter issues as opposed to foreign policy, is something that the entire US population does. Foreign policy doesn't play that pivotal a role in voting decisions. That's something that political scientists have shown time and again. So it's not surprising that that's the case here too. The second thing I'll say is that particular question on Israel and Gaza, we know from previous surveys, is subject to a lot of social desirability bias. So people answer in a specific way because they think that that's how they want to be perceived. So to get around that problem, we actually asked this question in a very unique way, which is we asked people if their workplace was donating $500 to a specific issue, or sorry, let me put it the other way around. If their workplace was donating $500, which issue would they be least happy about that money being donated to, which sort of gets at people's red lines on policy issues. And then we later on asked whether those candidates with those issues will be perceived well or not. And that's just to preview what's coming in the next report because we have not fully looked at that data yet.
So Milan, if I can add, I think there was, I don't know if you remember, we had discussed, there was a possibility at least that younger Indian American voters, especially US born, who are very progressive, were quite upset by the administration's views and actions regarding Gaza. However, if that were the case in terms of shaping their voting choices, we would expect them to not to vote, but we would not expect them to move to Trump because that's unlikely to offer a progressive stance. But we see only a small fraction who are saying that they're not going to vote. And the sample size is too small for us to look whether that might be because they have very strong views about Gaza. And that also is not supported by the fact that Muslim Indian Americans who would have seen this more strongly about Gaza, they are the most pro-Harris.
We just have about 60 seconds left, so maybe I'll just have the last word. I want to refer people who have a chance to look at the report to look at figures 20 and 21. And this goes to the hypothetical example that Sumitra mentioned, right? So we asked people, if you had $500 to contribute to an organization, which cause would you be most likely to contribute to? And interestingly, the number one thing that comes up is an organization that advocates for combating climate change and green technology, followed by, and this goes back to the salience of abortion, a pro-choice organization that wants to expand abortion access. The third most popular response, it was the response of 12% of respondents, is a nonprofit advocating for solidarity with Palestine and Palestinians, right? So there is some sign that this matters, but in the relative ranking, is not at the top. Last thing I'll say, and it's the last question we have time for, is information on how people view Biden. Two data points here we can turn to. The first is Biden's approval rating is positive. That is not true nationwide, as I think most people know. His numbers have been underwater, meaning his unfavorable has been higher than his favorable for a long, long time. The Indian American community doesn't see it that way. Majority of them believe Biden has done a good job. However, overwhelming support for Harris replacing Biden at the top of the ticket, right? So there doesn't seem to be a lot of kind of buyer's remorse of people wishing that Biden had been the nominee. It is 12 o'clock. We are going to wrap up. I want to just thank all of you for joining. I want to thank all of you for your engagement. Of course, I wanted to thank Sumitra, Devesh, our entire team at the Carnegie Endowment. A special shout out to Annabelle Richter, who is our fabulous junior fellow who helped do a lot of the data analysts for this report, as well as our partners at YouGov. This is, I think, our fifth or sixth engagement with YouGov, and it's been a really productive partnership. I hope you will keep posted and follow our upcoming work, which we'll have more to say about after November 5th. But on behalf of all three of us, thank you for joining. Happy Halloween and happy Diwali.